European Commission recently announced the Clean Industrial Deal, a policy package aimed at accelerating industrial competitiveness, decarbonisation, and circular economy. It's a critical package, but has it come too late? And will member states be able to implement the policy measures at the pace required and in a way that unites rather than fragments the region? To find out more about the key pillars of this deal and the next steps in terms of successful implementation, I had a conversation with Faustine Delasalle, Executive Director of the Industrial Transition Accelerator and CEO of Mission Possible Partnership. Faustine unpacks industry's reaction to the deal and emphasizes the need for collaboration and partnership within Europe's borders and abroad to ensure competitiveness is retained. I'm Pamela Largue, and this is the Energy Transitions Podcast. Faustine, thank you so much for joining me today. We're talking about a topic that's really been on everyone's radar, well, especially in Europe, and that's, of course, the Clean Industrial Deal. It's a really big package, and there's a lot to talk about. If you could paint a picture of the European industrial landscape, what would that look like? Would it be colourful, or would it be a little bit more grayscale? What are your thoughts on the picture of the landscape at the moment?
It's a good question. I'd say it's probably primarily grey, if we're honest. And European industry leaders have been vocal for several years now about the difficulties of the European industry, competitiveness issues that the European industry is facing today, due to a whole range of reasons, including in some sectors unfair competition from other producers around the world. But there are some more colourful touches on that grey background. There's innovation in the European industry. There's clean innovation. I think a number of clean technologies have been pioneered in Europe across multiple sectors like steel or cement or chemicals. And that's encouraging. But those touches are still small touches of colour on an overwhelmingly grey background, I'm afraid.
We're hoping to perhaps repaint the canvas with the Clean Industrial Deal, and it would be great to get your insights into some of the details of this package. Before we do, let's talk about the timing of this deal. It's important now, but has it come too late? And before you answer, Faustine, I came across an interesting comment, or should I say a post from Anne Mettler on LinkedIn. She's, of course, the VP of Europe at Breakthrough Energy. And the comment was, the trouble is that competitiveness is not a strategy. It's the outcome of successful policies over time, unquote. And that was really thought-provoking for me. And I just wonder, is it too late?
Look, I completely agree with Anne, and I think it is coming late. It is coming late on multiple fronts. It's coming late because the European industry is fragile today, so it's not the best place to start from to rebuild. It's coming late because it's coming post-energy crisis related to the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which has further fragilized the European industry. And from a climate perspective, which is something that I do care a lot about, it's coming late as well because we're running against time to actually invest in clean industry at scale and meet not only European climate targets, but also our global climate targets embedded in the Paris Agreement. Because it takes time to build industry. It takes time to build industrial plants. So if we want commercial scale clean industrial plants to be up and running in the early 2030s, investment decisions basically need to be taken in the next 12 months. So we're really running against the clock.
Indeed, running behind the clock. But, obviously there is a lot of hope and positive sentiment around this industrial deal. And perhaps we can look at some of the aspects of it, or the more salient aspects that you think are important? And would you be able to give us some more detail on that? It's such a large package, actually, so
It
comprehensive.
is a very large package.
So where do we start? Faustine, what do you think the highlights of this package are?
Like, let me just correct on the positivity around the package. I don't know if it's positiveness or if it's just a sigh of relief that finally this is on the horizon, right? I interpret it more as relief than real enthusiasm and optimism. In terms of the big buckets, I think there's a lot that is about what I consider to be a no-brainer, which is developing the circular economy. It's a way of reshoring industrial activities in Europe. It's a way of ensuring greater sovereignty of our industrial base. It's a way of revitalizing local economy. So that's a real no-brainer that Europe is pursuing. There's a lot in that package as well around reducing energy costs for energy-intensive industries. And it matters because they've been facing very high cost of fossil fuels, especially gas, over the past years. It matters because they need massive amounts of renewable energy at low cost to decarbonize as well. What worries me on that front is that Europe may not be best positioned around the world to produce cheap, abundant, clean energy. There are others around the Sun Belt of the world, across Africa, India, Australia, that might be better positioned than Europe to compete on energy cost. So that's something we can come back to. I think it's a structural issue that European policymakers may not have fully faced yet. And then what's really interesting in that package is that there's a lot around creating lead markets for clean commodities and made in Europe commodities, which is something we've been beating the drum on for several months now. We published last year a major policy playbook on how to stimulate demand for clean commodities, because what we've been hearing from project developers, big and small, for the past 12 months, is that they can't invest in new industrial plants and clean industrial plants if there's no buyer for the products that they will produce. So developing demand through policy is really a critical piece of the puzzle that we were missing in Europe, and it is finally very well embedded in the Clean Industrial Deal.
I have so many questions for you after that response. So where to start? First of all, I'm really pleased you clarified, or should I say distinguished, between the sigh of relief and the enthusiasm, because as you mentioned, industry has been calling for this for some time. And in a way, there was a state of desperation. What I'm understanding is the clear link between decarbonization and competitiveness. And that is actually, where Europe's advantage lies. If you think about competing with the US, for example, and China. But how do we reduce the cost of energy in a way that is going to support industry in its mission for greater competitiveness? How do we do that, Faustine? This is a mammoth task.
It is a mammoth task, and it is an issue that I don't think can be completely resolved. And that's where I'd be more nuanced than what you've said around putting an equal sign between decarbonization and competitiveness for the European industry. I do think that decarbonization can be a driver of competitiveness done in the right way, that developing circular models can be a driver of competitiveness, that European companies have developed a lot of the leading technologies to go clean. So that's a very strong set of assets. But I don't think that, unfortunately, that the European industry will ever, at home, benefit from energy costs that are as low as what the Middle East, North Africa, or India can offer in terms of clean energy costs. And so what hasn't been really thought through yet, I think, in Brussels and in different European capitals, is what's the trade-off between producing everything in Europe with energy costs that, yes, can be brought down from where they are today, but won't be as low as what you can find in the sunniest places in the world? Or are there other models where you accept that some pieces of your industry, the most energy intensive processes like iron making, for instance, do go offshore, do go to the sunniest places in the world, but you can diversify your supply chain and you keep in Europe the pieces that are less energy intensive, like the steel making. And that reflection on what are the pros and cons from a political perspective, I think hasn't really been thought through by policymakers.
A lot of food for thought there. And I'd like to just reference the fact that you are also CEO, Mission Possible Partnership. So you are very acutely aware of the state of various industries and their decarbonisation path in Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about where Europe is in terms of its industrial decarbonisation?
I think the European industry has been leading on technology development and on first-of-a-kind plants compared to the rest of the world. And it has a fairly large pipeline of commercial-scale clean industrial projects that have been announced, representing about a fifth of the global pipeline. So that's not ridiculous. But it's really struggling to bring those projects to final investment decision because of some of those structural issues that I was describing, especially on the energy costs and the lack of lead markets for clean commodities. So the Clean Industrial Deal, I think, should really focus on unlocking the pipeline of projects that already exists in Europe, but with the understanding that unfortunately isn't spread enough at this stage, that Europe's technology leadership is fading. That there are other regions in the world, China, India, Middle Eastern countries as well, that are pursuing clean industrialization very fast now. And so Europe cannot forever claim leadership in clean industry and really needs to go from demonstration to actual commercial scale operations very fast, but also find partnerships with other regions of the world that can provide clean energy to European industries and can provide bigger markets than the European market to those clean industries as well.
Faustine, in a conversation I had recently, somebody said, partnership is the new leadership. And in a sense, I feel partnerships are such a fundamental part of us reaching our decarbonisation goals. Yes, maintaining competitiveness, but it's very much a partnership model, which is perhaps not the way it's always been. So there is a bit of a mindset shift. And, I was reading some posts before this recording and people are saying, perhaps we should learn some lessons from China. So it's not necessarily about leading as much as it is about collaborating. What are your thoughts on this, Faustine?
I think that's absolutely right. There is a competitive dimension to the race to clean industrialization, obviously. But I think to strengthen European assets, Europe needs to partner up with other regions that have complementary assets. I was in India last week. India is already a renewable energy leader. They have the potential to produce clean energy, but also energy-intensive clean commodities for Europe, like ammonia, for instance. And on the reverse hand, they need technologies because they haven't been historically the leading developers of clean technologies. And they need those clean technologies to serve export markets, but also to serve their booming domestic market. So what type of really good trade partnerships could be found between Europe and India is one of the questions that I think is really worth exploring. And that our hope is that the recent visit from von der Leyen and the European Commission to India may have been a first step in that direction.
Pivoting back to the Clean Industrial Deal specifically, What is your vision for this? What are your hopes, and where are the potential pitfalls? Because we've got the deal, but now it comes down to implementation, and Europe can be notoriously fragmented in terms of how the member states perhaps are able to implement these deals. What are your thoughts on this? Because now it comes down to the action part.
I think fragmentation across member states and pace of implementation are two potential pitfalls. We've seen very bold hydrogen targets set a few years back, and Europe is not on track to meet those hydrogen targets because they haven't been translated into national policies and so do not really have teeth at this stage. So that's clearly a key thing to watch. The other thing that I would watch for is the specificities of the policies on how to create markets for things like clean steel, clean cement, or clean fertilizers. Right now, the text, which is good, emphasizes the fact that we need policies to create markets. It remains very blurry what type of policies to create those markets and how ambitious those policies will be in the short term. So that's something that is still to be shaped in collaboration with industry players.
Am I correct in understanding that your role, for example, at the ITA is to actually guide policymakers to a place of more clear, more ambitious policies that can actually stimulate market growth?
Indeed, absolutely. And some of the work we're doing now that we hope to bring to policymakers in the near future in Europe is really around the nuts and bolts of how do you put in place measures in the construction sector, for instance, or in the automotive sector that together represent a massive market for things like cement and steel and aluminium that will really drive demand for clean steel in a way that is big enough to trigger investment higher up the chain, because if it's really too small, then suppliers, steel producers or cement producers do not have enough on the horizon to actually invest. But that isn't either too high, because if it's too high, it will be unfeasible to meet that target within a short period of time. So it's a question of calibration of what's feasible but still high ambition in different markets that will use things like steel, cement, or aluminium in the future. So that's really the type of work that we're now engaging in Europe.
I've come across some stories of late where the lack of policy clarity has really impacted industries and their ability to invest in green technologies and actually move forward with their decarbonisation plans. It really has been a hindrance up until this point. So do you believe that this will change, that this industrial deal will actually make a tangible, clear change for industries, something that is going to provide some hope perhaps?
I do hope it will be able to do that. For it to happen, it needs to make a difference to the bottom line. That's as simple as that, right? As long as the measures that are laid out and implemented are not making a real difference to the cost of energy, making a real difference to the cost of imports for different critical supply chains, and on the other end of the spectrum, also making a real difference to the price that consumers are ready to pay for made in Europe clean products, then it doesn't make a difference to the investment case for major industrial companies. So the thing to watch is whether it has a real economic impact on the drivers of investment.
Indeed, it's the whole value chain down to the consumer as well. And of course, we do have the issue of the green premium. And I think perhaps there is still a great deal of change that needs to happen in the minds of consumers as well. But again, just balancing those decarbonisation goals with the need to meet the need of a healthy bottom line. It's really not an easy balance to achieve.
It's actually easier than one would think, because even if the cost differential, the green premium, is still relatively high for steel production or for aluminium production, is in the two digits level, 40%, for instance, for steel. If you run that through all the way down the value chain, it becomes a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller proportion of the end consumer product. So even if by 2030 we were to, for instance, build new houses with only clean cement, only clean steel, only clean aluminium, it wouldn't add to the cost of that house much more than 5%. But that's if we do 100%, which is unrealistic by 2030. So if we start by just doing 5%, 10% of clean cement, clean aluminium, clean steel in the construction, it will add less than 1% to the cost of your final home. And it's the same logic applies to all sectors bar aviation. So it's actually, it doesn't have to have a big impact on consumers. But in the current economic system, one player cannot move if not all players move at the same time. And that's why we need regulation to kick in, to create the conditions so that everyone moves in that direction, with actually a very negligible impact on consumer prices, but a big difference for the industrial players that are facing the biggest green premium at the level of the production of those key materials.
Faustine, based on what you've explained, I would assume that the next steps would then be to implement those mechanisms or mandates, as it were, to actually take this large clean industrial deal into a more granular, effective, tangible legislation. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And that's where we'll need leading businesses across all of those value chains, all the way up at the level of the energy suppliers, all the way down at the level of consumer goods companies, to join forces and say that this is feasible, and that it won't have a massive cost impact on the products consumed in Europe, but it will have a massive impact for the sustainability, the financial sustainability and the climate sustainability of the European industry. So those industry voices will be critical to ensure that there is enough political support for ambitious mandates and standards to move forward with this.
Faustine, you said this is feasible. So I would assume that you believe this is indeed feasible. Am I correct in that assumption? And are you perhaps an eternal optimist? How would you describe yourself and your opinion on the situation?
Look, our organization is called Mission Possible Partnership. So in itself, it's a sign of optimism. And when we came up with the name, it was because fundamentally we had seen that there was a feasible path to net zero emissions, including in heavy emitting industry sectors, both from a technical perspective, but also from an economic perspective. So I am confident we'll get there. The note of, I'd say, slightly more pessimism is on the pace at which we'll get there, and on whether Europe will move fast enough to strengthen its industrial base and its clean industrial base before other countries around the world jump on that opportunity and outcompete European players. So those would be my two notes of caution. But fundamentally, I do think we'll get to a point where a clean industry will be the new normal for industry in Europe, but globally.
Clean industry will be the new normal for Europe. That is indeed a great thought to conclude our conversation. But before we do so, Faustine, do you have any final comments or thoughts that you'd like to share about the industrial deal or anything that we've discussed?
I would just say the clean industrial deal is a critical piece of the puzzle to revitalize the European industry, but it cannot be thought through as if Europe lived in isolation from the rest of the world. And so really thinking through what are the new partnerships between Europe and emerging economies like India, like Brazil, like a number of North African countries, is, I think, critical to the future success of the European industry. We know that the Chinese industry players will try to outcompete everyone. There's obviously a lot of turmoil on the other side of the Atlantic. So Europe needs new allies as well in that journey. And I would encourage us to look abroad also for solutions that strengthen the European industry.
Faustine, I feel like we could talk about this for hours. It's such an in-depth topic, and perhaps one day we can consider having a follow-up podcast to see how Europe is tracking in terms of implementing these policies. But for now, this is all we have time for, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for joining us. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Energy Transitions podcast, brought to you by Enlit and Friends. That's a wrap from me, Pamela Largue, and our producer, Kamo Motse. We hope you can join us next time. Visit enlit.world or subscribe for more episodes.